Hey, Christian, good morning.
Good morning, Reed. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's one of the rare moments where I can say it's both a Friday morning for us and not a different time zone.
Exactly. This is a very rare occurrence.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm very much appreciative of you for being on today. I know already in the chat, quite a few people have talked about how how enjoyable they've or how much they really liked the ALM Toolkit and being able to use that for a lot of model development.
Yeah,
But for
yeah.
everybody tuning in, Christian's been with Microsoft for a few years, and we actually share a common past company. Like I've you worked for Chevron. I did over the years. I've done training on and off. Both directly under my own company and then back in the day for Power Pivot Pro with Chevron as
Yeah,
well. I actually
yeah,
I always try to do a little bit of Googling just before I have somebody on for some.
yeah,
I didn't realize
yeah,
you've only been at Microsoft since 2016. For some reason, it seemed like it's been a longer stint.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I think you've very quickly of course immortalized yourself with the clicky clicky draggy droppy phrase that I don't think will ever go away. And I'm honestly,
Yeah.
like, I'm curious, did you ever, when you said that, it must have just been one of those things. Did you actually plan that to be kind of like a catchphrase, or was that just said off the cuff and then people just latched onto it?
Yeah, it was set off the cuff in a spontaneous way, but funnily enough, when it first was used in that way, was actually in a trailer in the middle of an oil field, training a bunch of oil field roughnecks on how to use pivot tables against analysis services tabular models. So it's funny you should mention that about Chevron because that's actually where it originated from originally.
Okay.
Yeah, the very first time I used it. Yeah,
Oh, so that
and then they
it's
seem to
something
like
you've
it.
had for a
Yeah,
while. Yeah. Okay. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
it epitomizes very well. It's just, you grab and you just throw it into the wells and throw it onto the page and there you go, right? Like
Yeah,
it's trying to describe the ease, the ability to just, create magic very, very quickly. But
exactly.
I've seen
Yeah.
it on so many shirts now. It's really funny that it's become like it's become merchandised items. I'm hoping you get some royalties for that whenever one of
Yeah,
those
no,
shirts
no.
sell.
I'm probably the number one purchaser of those shirts. I'm probably one that's driving up the stock of that company that produces those shirts. But yeah, yeah. So yeah,
But
cool.
yeah, I think in general, I've given a little background about you, but getting a little bit of feedback. But if you want to share some information on just a little bit more about yourself and also just the ALM toolkit, I know a lot of people, it seems like in the chat already know about it, but I'm sure there's a few who are kind of curious of exactly what it is and what it can
Yeah,
be used for.
absolutely. And thanks, Reed, for organizing this. I appreciate
Yeah.
the opportunity to share, what our thoughts are and what we've been working on, and ALM Toolkit. And actually, ALM Toolkit originated well over 10 years ago, writing some AMO code on a plane, and it just kept evolving and evolving to what it is today. But yeah, so program management lead for the analysis services workload. So that covers basically the dataset workload in Power BI Premium, Azure
Hmm.
Analysis Services, and SQL Server Analysis Services, and a lot of these kind of semantic modeling capabilities for these enterprise BI or IT owned models for broad consumption that require things like scalability and
Hmm.
complexity with hundreds of tables and thousands of measures and these types of things, and obviously scalability to unlock massive data sets for interactive analysis, and those types of things that are all core to the analysis services engine.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that's what me and my team do. We work very closely with the analysis services engine engineering team. So my counterpart on the engineering side is called Akshay. You may know him. And yeah, so it's a good deal. We've got a lot of room to grow in Power BI Premium. We're seeing more and more, because Power BI is 5 years old, and obviously, it started off as a self-service BI tool, and we have a heritage in self-service BI since before that, with Power Pivot and things like that. But it was primarily a self-service BI tool, and over the years, it's really matured, and we've got a bunch of these enterprise BI capabilities built into it, and it's close to claiming full parity with Azure Analysis Services. We're getting a bunch of these enterprise workloads running now on Power BI Premium. It's growing like a hockey stick right now. So yeah, there's a lot of growth in the area of enterprise BI on the Power BI platform. So yeah, it's a great place to be at the moment. Yeah.
And I'll say it like too, just it went from kind of being on the satellite and remote parts of a really advanced development back in the day with a lot of these tools, because for a long time, like, you really couldn't use ALM against Power BI models. Like they were obviously the analysis services engine, but they were lock and keyed, and before external tools, it was more used for AAS, SQL Server Analysis Services on-prem, any of those ones. But yeah, like most of the customers just only using Power BI really didn't have access to that. So with this tool and all the others, it was a huge revolution. And I think I speak for myself and a lot of other MVPs when I say that, like, the external tools release was probably the biggest thing to come out for Power BI since like Power BI was created, just for being able to unlock so many advanced developer features. And I love that, like, almost every other month it feels like somebody comes out with a new tool to do something new related to it.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, Reid. Like, we have a 20-year heritage in enterprise BI at Microsoft. Analysis Services is over 20 years old now. And so, as you rightly said, Power BI datasets run on the Analysis Services engine, and the Analysis Services engine is really the kind of heart of Power BI. But it was all locked away, and you couldn't access it. And then we opened up the XMLA endpoint. We opened up external tools, and that just brought along this like heritage of tools and processes and partners and ecosystems and all of these these community tools for analysis services that are analysis services has a rich history of community tools going way back in the day with BIDS Helper for multidimensional models, and and before that, I think there was the MDX store procedure project, and there was a ton. Like, analysis services has been on this for decades, right? And so we managed to just pick up all of that heritage, that whole ecosystem, and put it right there in Power BI, and all of that. Everyone's skill sets and knowledge has just transferred over, and Power BI has inherited that big ecosystem. So yeah, it's really good. The fact that we're converging, these enterprise BI scenarios with self-service, it just provides a more streamlined message for the customer. It's a single entry point for the user. It bridges the gap between self-service and corporate BI. Before it was very segmented. It was like you're either enterprise BI or self-service BI. And even in customer organizations, like Chevron, like back in the day, it was kind of like there was IT and there was the business, and well, my number's right, no, your number's right. And there was all this competition, and we said, no, let's just work together. Let's bring it all together. Let's put it all on a single platform. Let's promote collaboration between the business and IT. Let's allow them to share artifacts more easily, share definitions, and it just provides a much more streamlined story. You don't need to stitch these different products together, but with Azure Analysis Services, we used to have this feature called import from PBIX, and honestly, it never worked very well. It was kind of like a beta feature. It was like an experiment with the web modeling that we had in Azure Analysis Services that we had to retire. But we saw usage of that thing like take off. Like, there was so many people that wanted to bring in these models from Power BI Desktop into Analysis Services. It was crazy, and we see this all the way back in the day, like with Power Pivot and import from Power Pivot into Analysis Services, right? So all of these people are trying to stitch together these different, and then there's so many of these features that we launch for the data set, and we're like, well, where are we going to launch it, in Power BI or in Analysis Services? And obviously Power BI is our strategic direction, so we'll launch it in Power BI, which means that if it's in Analysis Services, it doesn't work. Things like incremental refresh and aggregations. There's no tooling for it, and there's a bunch of these things that we launched that accrue to the value of the enterprise data sets. We're launching VNets, and there's a ton of these things, and we can't launch them on both of the platforms because it costs us twice as much. So we have to focus and deliver on Power BI. But then, so having that convergence is just going to be a win-win situation for everyone, I believe.
Exactly. And like you said, I think historically there was a lot more workarounds and hacks to get stuff working. I'm sure you're familiar with, like the Power Update tool that could like refresh a file and then publish that to like analysis services automatically, so you could still get Power Query and everything running through that. If you could turn the speakers down a little bit, I'm getting a bit of feedback.
Yeah, let me do that.
Sure.
Just a sec here.
Perfect.
Okay.
I think I'm good. Yeah, but it's okay, as you mentioned, with the opening of this and allowing people to basically work directly with Power BI files, it's really removed the need to also host separately in Azure Analysis Service and SQL Server Analysis Services. And I know the roadmap for Microsoft is really to consolidate everything. We're already running Azure in the backend on Power BI just with the skin, but basically providing the tenant within Power BI to do a one-stop shop for everything with all the tools needed without having to exist in multiple ecosystems across different Microsoft products. So it's becoming, features are being added, but it is also, when the architecture is deployed correctly, becoming much more efficient and automated, and less room for error and breakage without you having 18 links in the chain to get from your data to the end reports.
Exactly. We're about simplifying the architecture diagram that we present to customers when we start the conversation. And a lot of customers might purchase, we've seen customers purchase premium for the front end on top of analysis services, which means that they, by definition, therefore have some redundant data set capacity. If you converge and consolidate all of those AS servers and especially on the Gen 2 architecture, where you're going to get really good benefit from consolidation on the higher Gen 2 SKUs, you're going to get the maximum throughput, the maximum model sizes, you're going to get an unlimited total data set size, concurrency, improved cost of ownership. On those Gen 2 SKUs, if so many customers have like 3 P1s, 1 P3, 3 Azure AS servers, if you just consolidate all of that onto the Gen 2 platform, then you're gonna get cost savings ultimately from that perspective, because you will need a fewer number of nodes across your architecture, and it just simplifies things. So yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I am getting a couple of questions about certain features of this that I'm sure will be covered in the demo, but I think this will be a good opportunity to flip over and kind of dive into like the ALM Toolkit itself. So
absolutely.
And as they come up,
we can keep things super interactive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'll bring up questions as they pop up in the chat window if they're relevant to what we're going over.
Okay, cool. All right, so ALM Toolkit, you can get it from here. It's an open source tool. Like I said, I started building this over 10 years ago on a plane. It's just been like a hobby, and it just evolved. And it's a schema diff tool for analysis services tabular models, which with XMLA endpoints, and as we were discussing, means that it's also a schema diff tool for Power BI datasets. And the ALM Toolkit, the heritage of ALM Toolkit is based on a tool called BISM Normalizer, which was run in Visual Studio as a Visual Studio extension that would kind of accompany SQL Server data tools. But then with Power BI and XMLA endpoints and this shift to Power BI as the center of gravity, most of the Power BI users aren't using Visual Studio. So that's why it made sense to create a separate version of this called ALM Toolkit, which is not part of Visual Studio, but it's actually all part of the same build. If I just yesterday, someone was on the GitHub forum, and they said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if I could, now that we've just launched object level security, and we've got object level security and row level security, I want to be able to change my OLS and RLS rules in my roles while still maintaining the same members in the roles, right? Because maybe on my test and production environments, I've got a different set of users who have access to the models, but I still have the same roles." So I said, well, maybe we could have that ability to retain the role members. So I built that yesterday, and I just deployed it yesterday. And that's just an example of when I add these features, or I do a bug fix or something, it shows up in both of the products. There's still a big population of users using BISM normalizer, but it's the same build, it's the same process, it's the same code base as ALM Toolkit. But then, you know, ALM Toolkit has a different front end. Obviously, it's not hosted in Visual Studio. But then this diff control here is actually TypeScript. I get some customers asking me, why is the BISM normalizer installer like 1 byte big, and the physics file, and the ALM Toolkit is like 250 megabytes? And the reason is that this is hosting a Chromium instance in this app, exactly the same way that Power BI Desktop does it, right? So if you look at Power BI Desktop in the report view, it's exactly the same look and feel, and the report looks identical to when you see it in the browser, because it's the same code, it's the same TypeScript code. It's running in a Chromium instance in Power BI Desktop, right? Exactly the same as this. This is why the installer is 250 megabytes, right, for ALM Toolkit. And so this is running in a Chromium instance. This is all TypeScript based. This is the same diff control that you get in Visual Studio Code. It's the Monaco diff control, and so ALM Toolkit has decoupled from Visual Studio, and it's a more modern front end, but the back end is all the same. All of the code behind, all of the logic, you know, most of the code behind this is kind of validation code to ensure the integrity of the target model when you do these different merges. But yeah, that's a short history of it. Okay. So let's see, in terms of what people use it for, right? It's a very generic tool. Like, you can use it for a ton of different things, and people make up, you know, I hear about people doing things with it that I hadn't even imagined from time to time. But the most common use cases for it are things like a low-code, no-code experience for deployment across environments, much like deployment pipelines in Power BI, which is, you know, getting a lot of usage. So deployment pipelines, you can set up your development, test, and production workspaces as your kind of environments, and then do a kind of a diff between, say, dev and test, and it will show you exactly what artifacts have been added, removed, or updated, right? And in this kind of nice little diff script that looks much like the diff kind of experience in ALM Toolkit, and it lets you pick and choose which objects you want to deploy across environments, and so you can do a selective deployment, and it will do some validation, kind of like as a guardrail, to make sure that you don't compromise the integrity of the target environment. So it won't let you deploy a report that depends on a data set that you've chosen not to include in the deployment, right? So it will do that validation. So it's a very similar concept here with ALM Toolkit. It's a visual guided experience with guardrails that lets you easily manage the metadata across environments. That's one of the use cases. You can use it much like schema compare in SSDT and other schema diff tools like Redgate SQL Compare that now ships in a base version of it ships in Visual Studio nowadays. And so, you know, much like when you're deploying a new version of a data warehouse, you don't drop and recreate the whole data warehouse and reload all the data. You will just create a diff script, for example, or a DAC pack, but you can create a diff script that will bring the schema up to the latest version while still retaining the data, right? And so it's a very similar concept. You can generate a script in ALM Toolkit. You can hand it over to the deployment person responsible for deployments, etc. Right? So you can use it for these kind of incremental metadata-only deployments. Now, there are, especially in the managed services world, there are a lot of customers, like enterprise customers, that will have automated CI/CD type deployments, and in those scenarios, you will quite often have like a separate repo for bug fixes, or a bug fix branch. And then you need to, for example, do some bug fixes there without depending on a full deployment, because those CI/CD deployments are kind of all or nothing. You can't pick and choose what you want to deploy. They're a little bit less flexible from that perspective. So, you know, when you're doing a full deployment based on CI/CD, it's more of a bigger process, and you need to make sure that everything is pushed all together across all the environments. So therefore, you need the agility to have like a bug fix branch if you need to do a bug fix. Well, if you do a bug fix in the bug fix branch, you want to push that into the main branch without having to reinvent the wheel. You just want to do a diff and merge between your production branch and your main branch. And we see this all of the time. Like in Microsoft, every time I ask for a demo for a conference or something, the developers will create a repo for a demo repo, and they'll do some stuff in there, and then maybe they want to harvest that work and put it back in another branch, or there are repos all over the place, right? And so, and we see this in the development world, we see this with tabular models, and it's not as simple as just doing a JSON merge in Visual Studio Code. Like if you do diff and merge using tools like Visual Studio, there will be if you're doing like a different merge across C# projects, there will be safeguards to ensure you don't create two versions of the same function with the same, right? In different files, and there'll be safeguards there. So basically, it provides this controlled environment for diff and merge. You can have multiple developer. If you're in a multiple developer scenario, right? It's not as simple as just taking the work that one developer did and automating the merge of that into doing a JSON merge, because you'll break the build, right? You'll create relationships that point to columns that don't exist. You'll create M expressions that point to that refer to M expressions that don't exist. There's a ton of like interdependencies between all of these tabular model objects, and this is what like 80% of the code behind this is, just validating all of those dependencies to make sure you don't break the model, right? That's really what the primary thing that this tool does. So and you can also use it to reuse common objects across models, things like conformed dimensions, like date dimensions, and common dimensions across tabular models. You make a change once, you don't have to do the same change in a bunch of them, right? You can use it for that, which is a similar kind of use case to composite models, the direct query over AS, but the direct query over AS is geared for the analyst, right? So this is more geared for the pro model, where there are some cases where you would want to use direct query over AS even for a pro model, but most of the time that's geared for the analyst. For the pro, you're typically going to want the data locally for improved performance, so you don't do large joins across different models on the fly. And then if you want to harvest, objects, or another use case is just for prototyping. We've seen this back in the day with Power Pivot. Okay. People will do prototyping in Power Pivot. They want to harvest those objects and put them in the main model in their development environment. Yeah. They then want to iterate on it and ensure that it aligns with common naming standards and best practices and business definitions and architectural designs and things like that. And then they want to iterate on it in their development environment, but it really accelerates the process, right? It accelerates the process. You can still retain the original intent of that artifact, whether it was created by some business analyst somewhere where he did it as a prototype, or it's just model management, master metadata management. You've got like one instance of a model that is inherited by other models. You then deploy a new version of that base model, and you want the other ones to inherit it. That you can use it for master metadata management. The use cases are just like that. It just goes on and on and on. There are a bunch of these use cases.
By the time any company matures to the point where they're doing any type of DevOps or especially multi-author and development for models and stuff, both this and then like tabular editor really just become like cornerstones for pushing through life cycles. And I mean, also just with large enterprise models, like it's not feasible, to have to edit a PBIX file if you're dealing with hundreds of millions or billions of rows, and then you have to refresh all the data and republish and everything from that. So being able to then change one portion of the code, deploy that through the pipeline for testing and bug checking before production, like all of this really, really does help support that for, like I said, I would say like by the time you get to the level of needing to have those checks and balances, or just dealing with really large data sets, this comes in handy for so many different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, and as you described, by the time an organization gets to that level of maturity, and then once they do, they can use it for all of the different merge scenarios that we described with multiple repos. But during that journey, right, where they're starting from, okay, I don't really know what MS Build is. I've never created a DevOps build pipeline. And honestly, I've written some MS Build scripts, like the MS Build script for ALM Toolkit. It's not something that, any Tom, Dick, or Harry could write, right? They're quite advanced. These CI/CD scripts are quite advanced, and maybe you're on a project and you just haven't prioritized that work yet, but you still need to get a version out there as an initial version for the users to look at and test. So it's going to help you on that journey, right? So you can use it as a way to manage the metadata across these environments very easily, very quickly. Just like this is why deployment pipelines is taken off, because it allows customers to get up and running very, very quickly in a very visual, very guided way, and be successful without any kind of prerequisite knowledge, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does, and I'm just checking some of the questions that are in here. Actually, I just have one, I guess, that's I think a pretty broad question that I'll just pop up onto the screen. Somebody was just asking, like, is this meant to be used by the business, or would it be used more in IT? I'd speak that it's definitely a development tool, so this usually is, primarily consumed by the person who's normally the I'd say the developer and or like the admin of the Power BI tenant that's doing a lot of this deployment. The person who certainly has permissions to be able to push this up either to Azure Analysis Services, SSAS, or the Power BI tenant.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Reid. There may be some use cases that there's some when your target is a Power BI desktop file. It's quite limited because of like with Tablet Editor, there are a certain set of objects that Tablet Editor can modify in the Analysis Services metadata that is in the Analysis Services engine behind Power BI Desktop. They happen to be the ones that are particularly valuable because they happen to be things that Power BI Desktop doesn't support, right? So it's like calculation groups and perspectives and metadata translations and object level security rules. These are precisely the things that Power BI Desktop doesn't support. So it's like this release valve, which is one of the reasons Tablet Editor as an external tool is so popular. But yeah, it's the same applies here, right? If my target is a Power BI Desktop model or a PBIT file, you can make the target be a PBIT file. Because they haven't done the work that we internally call desktop hardening work, where desktop will be hardened to external model changes. So there's only certain objects that you can modify as using external tools. But as we relax that, as we start hardening more of it, then there'll be more of those use cases. Perhaps an advanced analyst could maybe reuse some common definitions or a common table that they like to use in a lot of models, and they can find an easy way of reusing it. There's obviously PBIT files, but there are some cases where you just want to reuse the model. So there'll be lots of use cases, I'm sure, that I haven't even imagined. But yeah, I agree with you. It's primarily for the kind of BI Pro or IT owned models.
Yep. Very well said.
Yeah, cool. Cool. All right. So let's see. Anything else, or should I move on?
You're welcome to move on.
Okay, cool. So as we discussed, it's really an XMLA client, right? The XMLA protocol was defined like, I think it'll be, I don't know, 8 years ago. It was, there were multiple companies. It was an industry standard. Some of the big kind of traditional BI vendors back in the day, Hyperion, Essbase, and those people were all involved in it. But that's the XMLA protocol. But once we talk about the XMLA endpoint, what we're really talking about is exposing that protocol so that you can have access to the Analysis Services engine that's running in Power BI. And it's the same interface that all of the client libraries use, and therefore all of the tools for Analysis Services use. That's why we opened this up, and then you can use SQL Server Management Studio, you can use SSDT, you can use Profiler, you can use a bunch of these third-party tools, and so you open up XMLA endpoint, and ALM Toolkit is just another XMLA client. So you need to open up the XMLA endpoint for read-write for it to work, right? Which you're probably aware of. Most of the people on the call are probably aware of that. I will also mention that XMLA write operations in general, not purely for ALM Toolkit, but XMLA write operations in general tend to perform better against the large model storage format. and we are optimizing. Large models only hit general availability, let's see, in December, right? And so it got to a point of stability where we were happy to call it generally available. We got the UI for you to be able to set it, so that you don't need to depend on PowerShell. But the XMLA write operations in general tend to perform better on the large model storage format, because if you have it the way that it is by default for Power BI datasets, every time you make a change, like if you think about the traditional self-service BI use cases, it was like I'd publish the dataset, I do a refresh, and then if I want to maybe download to PBIX, any of those operations would generate an internal backup that's up in the service, like the backup files for analysis services is called ABF, right? ABF file. It'll generate an ABF file so that it's ready when you want to, say, download to Power BI Desktop, for example. And so the traditional storage format for datasets in Power BI was what we internally call the ABF storage format. But then the large model storage format is more like the Azure Analysis Services storage format, right? Where just like with SQL Server Analysis Services on-prem, you can go into the data folder and you can see a ton of these files with a different file for each column, etc. So if you enable the large model storage format, it uses that kind of analysis services storage mechanism, which means that if you're going to add a measure, it's just a metadata operation, and it should be pretty much 1 second to add a measure to a model that is a 100 gigabyte model, right? Whereas if it was an ABF, the reason those ABFs can't go beyond 10 gig is because every time you make a change to that, it needs to generate a new ABF, right? So even on a 1 gigabyte model, if you're going to add a measure using XMLA endpoint, it's going to generate a new backup, and it could it could take whereas here it's going to generally be like 1 second to add a measure. So the large model storage format, which by the way we continually optimize. There were a couple of teething issues with it initially. We are continually optimizing it. We were talking just yesterday about making the default segment size more comparative to Azure Analysis Services. And there's a ton of these optimizations. We talk about large models very frequently, and it's continually being optimized. And as I say, it works better for these XMLA write operations. Okay.
What is the upper limit? Somebody just asked in the comment. Isn't it the size of your capacity? It's like not actually a limit of the model. It's whatever your premium capacity is. So your storage basically as actual memory. That's the limit for. And what is it? I should know this, but what is the very largest capacity? The most expensive one. What is the actual size for that? I'm curious.
Yes, it's the P5. It's 400 gigabytes of memory, and obviously the model itself typically is the model itself typically isn't going to get to 400. Like probably the biggest you'll get to is maybe just over 350. Because it needs an extra buffer for refresh operations, because as refresh operations occur, not all the data is compressed during the refresh operation. So it needs an extra buffer. You can optimize your refresh operations using things like incremental refresh, so that you pull a lot less data and you need less memory during the refresh operation. The biggest capacity is the P5. It's 400 gigabytes of memory. It's not. It's kind of you need to ask us to spin it up for you, because the hardware for it. We need to purchase a X number of nodes on each of the clusters, on each of the regions, right? So we need to have some kind of a commitment before we spin those up. And it's actually the same hardware that we use for the S9 V2s in Azure Analysis Services. It's exactly the same, right? But with Premium Gen 2, I just thought I'd mention this, right? So with Premium Gen 2, it's currently it's still in public preview, right? And it's currently running on basically the P3 machines. But over the next, I'd say 12 months or so, we have plans to migrate to a new generation of hardware, right? Which is we've done on initial testing. It's based on an AMD processor that is superior to the processors that are running in Power BI and in Azure Analysis Services today. That will make the availability of these P5s greater, right? there are some Azure Analysis Services customers that were looking at migrating to Power BI Premium, and it wasn't easy for us to make the P5 available for them as much as we wanted to. So with this new generation of the hardware, it's superior hardware. It's going to proliferate the availability of these big SKUs. And then obviously on Power BI Premium Gen 2, you can have multiple large data sets. You know, you're not capped to 400 gigabytes for all of your data sets. You can have multiple large data sets, and the ones that aren't frequently used will get loaded into memory dynamically. And we're also working on one other thing, which will launch, but you know, in the next couple of months, we're gonna launch a feature called lazy loading of models. We've discussed this before as dynamic memory management. So with Power BI, you know, we'll swap data sets in and out of memory so that the data sets that aren't being used don't need to use up memory on your capacity. We do this even in Gen 1. Whereas Azure Analysis Services, all of your data sets have to be in memory all of the time, right? So I've got a hard upper limit in Azure Analysis Services in terms of my memory consumption. Well, in Power BI, we swap them in and out, which is a lot more efficient and gives you more kind of headway. But we're also working on actually loading the subset of the data set into memory, only on an as required basis in a very efficient way, which will, in theory, get you beyond even 400 gigabytes in size, right? We'll be able to swap in and out the data in and out of memory that will get you beyond 400 gigabytes. So we're working on that. The first version of that will be released probably in a couple of months. It's going to be lazy loading of the data set into memory. And over time, this will really redefine the playing field in terms of what are the biggest considerations for large models today. Obviously, memory and CPU. So the memory variable in the equation will be reduced significantly because of this work that we're doing. Yeah.
It's just it's crazy just the level of data that you can throw into there. At least the only times that I've ever seen it usually climb to that degree are people who are monitoring activity of some type of devices by seconds or minutes, where you're just getting trillions of rows of data that's coming in, and even under compression, it still manages to eat up like 250, 300 gigabytes into the storage capacity.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the cardinality is a huge deal. I've seen some customers with, I don't know, I can't remember the numbers, but let's just say like 40 tables, and they'll remove 2 columns that were identified as really high cardinality, and the size of the model comes down by a third or something like that.
That's still one of my...
The cardinality has a big impact.
That was one of my favorite training experiences ever. Was a couple of years ago. I was down somewhere in California. I think it was an oil and gas company, if I recall. But they had like a 1.9 gigabyte file, and why is this so large? And I just did a quick scan. I noticed there was an ID column. Like, what's this for? We need to know counts of orders. Okay, but this is unique per row. It's 47 million rows. Like, so you don't actually need the ID, right? You just need a count. Okay, so do a count rows. I right-clicked and deleted it, saved it. It went from 1.9 to like 350 megabytes instantly. And there is just like, I swear, 30 to 60 seconds of just people like looking around, like, why didn't any of us know to do this? But it's one of those great, like, this is why I'm here at providing this training, is like, this is what you need to look for. But cardinality is the number one killer. I've had like a 400 gigabyte 400 million row lookup table that was needed for rollup security of just 2 columns, but each column had 5 to 10 unique IDs in it, but maybe a few more than that, but it was just the combination of that required so many rows. That thing only adds like 10 megabytes to the model. So it's crazy how well the optimization of the tabular engine that can manage to compress large data sets, as long as you don't have too many unique values.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then the lazy loading will only load. There are a lot of columns that actually don't get used, right? If you look at it statistically, like we have the ability to do this kind of statistical analysis in some kind of sandboxes and things. And I mean, statistically, a lot of columns don't get used. So not loading them into memory in the first place, not using up that extra memory, is going to be a significant efficiency kind of at the macro level.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right, cool. So let's see. So ALM Toolkit is a pretty easy to use tool. There's just like 5 or 6 buttons on the ribbon. There's a lot of code behind it, but it's pretty easy to use. So I'll pause there before I jump into the demo. Is there any other questions, or should I just jump into the demo?
There was a couple. So here's one. Let me pop this up right here. This is a general question. Like when we do metadata deployment, certain model changes require dataset refreshes and certain don't. Is there a way developers know? Now, I will say, like, from knowing the information, you'll know like Power Query changes, anything that requires a query change will do those. Adding a measure does not, but there's also not necessarily a flag for people maybe getting familiar with it. So I think that's probably what the question's alluding to. Is there a notification that says whether or not this would require basically the data set to refresh upon publishing changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I can provide you some links to some videos from Patrick LeBlanc that talk about this type of thing. Okay. Because, you know, the Analysis Services Engine is actually quite good at allowing you to get away with not having to refresh data. So you can delete a column from a billion row fact table and not have to reload all the history. Obviously, if you add a new column, it will never have seen that column before. It won't have all of the historical values. So it will put in a blank for all of the historical values of that column if you add a column to an existing table. But yeah, this is really what it's about. It's like maintaining not touching the metadata as much as possible, like not messing with it as much as possible, you know, because if you don't mess with it, then there's more likely, there's a greater likelihood that the Analysis Services Engine will do a good job of just retaining that history and avoiding unnecessary refreshes. And this is really what ALM Toolkit is about, right? So like, for example, incremental refresh, you'll generate a ton of partitions on the version. This is exactly what my demo is going to do in a minute. You'll generate a ton of partitions of the model in the service. And then if you do a republish from Power BI Desktop, it's just going to give you the version that you have in Power BI Desktop, which, you know, is only going to be like a small subset, like a small sample of the data using incremental refresh. And then you'll blow up those partitions. You'll lose that metadata from those partitions. You'll lose all of that history, and you need to wait like a couple of hours to reload all of the history. Whereas if you use this tool, you can say, oh, there's all these partitions here. I don't want to mess with those. I can see that, you know, I'm not adding a column. This isn't going to require a reload of all the data. I can maintain it. I can even make changes to that table. I can change the formatting of columns, or, you know, I can add new measures to the table. I can do whatever I want and still retain those historical partitions so that I don't need to reload the data. So that's a good question. Exactly. And this is a really important thing, is not having to reload the historical data. And it can be a little bit advanced. Like I say, I can give you some links to some of Patrick LeBlanc's videos that drill into this a bit more.
Perfect.
Cool. Brilliant. All right, so let's jump into the demo. So we're going to run till for another 15 minutes or so, right?
It's a soft stop. Like, I mean, when I had Marco on, we went until like 40 after. Probably not that long, but if there's buffer room and you have other stuff to cover and we go 10 or 15 over, that's totally fine. I just have it basically roughly an hour, just like any other like user group presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So I should be reasonably good, I think, in terms of the demo, but we can have some Q&A and just keep things interactive. Perfect. So I've got this Power BI data set, right? So let's say, you know, this is already a model that's deployed in the service. I got a ton of users using it, and I just want to make some enhancements to the model. This is a common situation, right? And so this is using, just like we were just describing, it's using incremental refresh. So the version that I have here in Power BI Desktop is filtered using the range start, range end parameters to only have, you know, a few thousand rows in, and the PBIX is super small. But the version in the service has got like 10 years of data, and an example that I often use with the same data warehouse that's right behind this data set. It loads up to 70 gigabytes with 3 billion rows, right? And so this has got 10 years of data. You know, this might take 3 hours to load on the initial bootstrapping. And actually, Patrick has a video on how to bootstrap in an efficient way without hitting timeouts and stuff. Because when you load that data for the first time, it's going to take longer, right? So
Yeah.
this data's all loaded. I've already gone through all of that. I've already bootstrapped the system. I really don't want to have to reload the historical data, right? So I've added some extra, I think, calculation groups and translations using external tools like Tablet Editor. And there's also a new one called, like you said, there are new external tools popping up all over the place.
Yes.
There's a good one for translations that has come up called Metadata Translator that uses Azure Cognitive Services to default all of your translations for you. So I've added some translations, and I've added some calculation groups, and I'm using Tablet Editor, and I've made some enhancements to the model, but they're predominantly just like metadata enhancements, like calculation groups and some measures and things like that, and translations. It's not stuff that should require me to reload those 10 years of data, right?
Exactly.
So what am I going to do? I want to push this out to my users. So I'm going to click publish, right? The standard publish flow here in Power BI Desktop. I click publish, and then it says, oh, you've already got a version of this data set. I say, I know, that's the one that all my users are using. Do you want to replace it? And I was like, no, because like I said, the one that I have here in desktop has got like a few thousand rows. If I replace it with the one from here in desktop, I'm going to have to reload all the data. I'm going to have to go through that whole process all over again, which I don't want to do, right? So what do? So first off, I'm going to click the view impact link here, just because I like the way that this works and it illustrates the concept. So I click here on the view impact. And this gets me over to the lineage view that shows me that, as I'm sure everyone's aware, gives me all of the interdependencies between the Power BI artifacts from data source all the way through to dashboard.
One of the best features to come out.
Yeah. Sorry. Did you
I was just saying, being able to see impact changes was one of the best features to come out in the last year. Like it.
Yeah,
it's really nice to I didn't actually. Oh, there's 2 other reports. I probably should actually. They connected to this. I should see if anything that I'm changing is going to impact those. So I've seen a lot of companies avoid issues with that.
It will give you all of the reports, even in other workspaces. So for these kind of semantic modeling scenarios where you have one data set that's consumed across a bunch of departments with a bunch of different users in different countries and things like that, this is super, super useful. And it also lets you notify all of those report owners, right? That you're going to make a change, that you're going to, I don't know, this data set will be multilingual as of tomorrow, something like that, right? So, so it lets you notify them as well. And then I'm going to come into the settings here. I'm sure everyone has seen this. I'm going to come into premium. This is where you get the workspace connection. This unassuming little text box here that doesn't, whoops. I'm doing zoom it on the different screen. So this little text box here is gives you what you can use in place of the analysis services server name, which gives you that backwards compatibility with all of the analysis services tools and processes based on the XMLA endpoint.
Exactly.
This is basically your entry point into the XMLA endpoint, this little text box here. So I can copy this into the clipboard. Here I've got the large model storage format already selected. So this is all good. And so what am I going to do now? I'm going to come back to Power BI Desktop, and I'm going to cancel out of here because I don't want to replace it. So I'm going to come into external tools, and I've got a ton of external tools here. It's just grown virally. The Mike Carlo has got an installer of a bunch of cool ones, and it's just taken off. I like. I can open Tableau against a data set, no comment. And I'm gonna go ahead and run ALM Toolkit.
And, so you're one of the only people that I've seen that. I was just saying you're only one of the, and I just took our video off for a second, but you're one of the few people that it's so long that I was always wondering, what does it look like when you hit the limit of the width? And apparently it adds an ellipses. I was wondering if there would be a scroll bar, but I'm assuming that ellipses shows you the remaining external tools.
Yeah.
That's the first time I've seen that, so it's crazy.
It's crazy. We've talked about it internally. We're going to have to restructure the ribbon just because of external tools, because we've run out of real estate on the ribbon. It's nuts. Yeah. So it's picked up that my source model is Power BI Desktop because that's where I launched it from, right? But it could be another data set in the service, or it could be a file, right? So it could be, a BIM file or which is an analysis file format, or a PBIT, right? So I'll leave it as Power BI Desktop, obviously, in this case, and then we'll go ahead and deploy to this data set. Or we could be exporting to a file as well. So I'll go ahead and run this as the comparison. And now it will connect up to the Power BI service, and then it will perform a schema diff. It will analyze each of the objects individually, and it will check it will compare the versions of the metadata, right? So I'm gonna make this nice and big. So perfect. Let's see. So for example, this currency table is the same in the source and the target model. So it looks, so that it has the same definition, and it's exactly the same. This is the same Monaco diff control that you use in Visual Studio Code when you're doing JSON merges and C# merges in Visual Studio Code. So then, but then it says, oh, well, you're creating this calculation group, and it has this calculation item, and here's the DAX for the calculation item. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say hide skip objects with same definition, so that I can focus just on the differences. And let's say we've got this game table is the one with the incremental refresh policy, right? And if I scroll down here, you can see that these are all the partitions in the target that hold all of the historical data, which is exactly what I don't want to mess with, right? I don't want to, just like the person asked earlier, you know, how do you optimize it so that you don't have to do unnecessary refreshes? So in this case, I don't want to mess with this metadata, because if I do, if I lose this metadata, I'm going to have to reload all of the history. So there's different options here, right? I can actually perform an update against this table and still retain the partitions. Like if I want to, I don't know, change the format of a column or something. But what I'm going to do in this case, I'm just going to skip it, so I can pick and choose what I want to deploy. So I'll go ahead and skip that one. And then for whatever reasons, I don't want to deploy these measures either, because I'm still working on them. Again, it's just like deployment pipelines. I can selectively pick and choose what I want to deploy, and so I don't want to touch those either. And then I've got this trip table that exists in the target but not the source. Now, in the case where you know, I'm harvesting objects from one model to another, maybe I did some prototyping, and I want to integrate those objects into my main kind of corporate model. Quite often, I don't want to mess with anything in the. I could have hundreds of tables in the target model that I don't want to mess with, right? So rather than coming into individually skipping all of them individually, and then coming in and obviously I can multi-select, but rather than having to skip them all individually, in that scenario, it's quite common that you would say, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and skip all of the objects that are missing in the source, and then all of them, even if there are hundreds of them, get skipped in one action, right? And now I'm going to hide all of the skipped objects, and now I can see exactly what I'm going to push. I'm going to push this new calculation group, and I've got some translations here that I want to push as well. And so now I perform the validation. So this is really the key, right? This is why you can't just do a JSON merge across Tableau Object Model metadata, because you can compromise, you can mess up the target model, because there'll be a ton of these interdependencies between the objects. So this is going to validate that you're not going to mess up the model, right? So, and it's going to disallow you from doing anything that would mess up the model. So for example, I've got this discourage implicit measures, which is actually a requirement in order to have calculation groups. But I may not know that, right? Or I may have just done it because this is, I may have just missed it. And so now I'm gonna try and create this calculation group, these calculation items without discourage implicit measures set to true. And now if I validate again, then it's gonna say, I'm unable to create the calculation group because you don't have discourage implicit measures set to, which you can just about see there.
Perfect.
And therefore I can't get the calculation items either. It will still let me do the schema diff. It will still let me push everything else, right? It's just not gonna generate a script that will fail when you run it, right? Even some of the schema diff tools for relational databases, like schema compare, they will let you create a non-nullable column on a table that has data, which is gonna, by definition, it's gonna fail, right? So this will disallow. This has got guardrails to disallow you from messing things up, right? And it will alert you ahead of time. You can fix it up ahead of time, and you'll know that you'll be you're more confident that you're not going to mess things up, right? So I'll go ahead and update this again, right? And now if I validate again, it should be fine. And so now we're back in good shape. So now I'll go ahead. At this point, I could generate a script, which would just be an XMLA file, which you can open in SQL Server Management Studio, like a create or replace tabular model scripting language script. I can, report differences. I'll go ahead and just update the target directly in this case. So it will push the calculation groups and the translations. Depending on my refresh options, I think I'm just going to do a quick process. Yeah, I'm doing a quick process recalc in here, but I have options to, only process the affected tables or just do a process default. I'm not typically going to do a full reprocess from here, even though I could. So I've done that. Now I'll go ahead and refresh the comparison again. And we should see that the objects that we pushed through are now the same between the source and the target. So here is the calculation item. It's the same. And all of the items that I skipped are still different, right? So they're still with a status of skip. But for example, here's the game table with the partitions that I didn't want to mess with. I didn't mess with them. They're still there. So I didn't lose all of that historical data, right? So I did this deployment. It took me a few seconds. It was very straightforward. I didn't have to reload all of that historical data, and I retained all of that stuff, right? And all of the other objects that I skipped are still skipped. And what I can also do here is I'm going to go ahead and save this as an ALMT file. I'll just put it here. I'll just call it comparison one. I'll just go ahead and replace it, right? And now I'm going to close this, and let me quickly reopen that from here. So I'm reopening that file that I just saved, right? And now it remembered everything, right? It remembered the source and the target. It also remembered the options. So I'll just reconnect and I'll show you. It remembered the options. And it even remembered the individual skip items that I chose not to skip. So this will get me into the exact same state that I was just a second ago before I saved the file, right? Even all of these options, I've got exactly the same option selected here. So this is very important because I don't want to have to, quite often when you're doing these, like if you're deploying these changes, you're going to have the same option, that same option selected each time, right? And you don't want to have to be dependent on remembering, like if I go and forget to say retain policy-based partitions, that could be a problem, right? So, if I can minimize the manual intervention here and just say, okay, I'm going to pre-define all of this. I know exactly which objects I don't want to mess with. These roles, I know I don't want to mess with those because they've got certain users in them that for each environment or whatever it is. There's a lot of like repetition in the operations that you want to perform for a particular data set. So this allows you to store all of that and then come back to the exact same state when you're going to want to deploy the next changes of the new measures or whatever it is, right? And so and here are the refresh operations, right? And this is what people used to do here in BISM Normalizer. They'd create these files that you can just say add a new tabular model comparison, and then you create one of these files, and you can associate it with the project, and then you have everything pre-stored. This is the same options dialog, just an older version of it. But yeah, it's the same thing that people used to do in Visual Studio as well. So basically, that's it.
I have a really good question because we were doing a lot of like just diff comparisons, replacements, and everything else. And James often has really great questions whenever I do my live streams. But can you perform a text find replace? So basically, just across any of the metadata for like a single, like say, unique name. Is there a way to do like a quick swap out across all different like components, or do you have to kind of do it one at a time?
Yeah, unfortunately not, James. Unfortunately not. Like you could possibly do that directly in the JSON in a safe way, perhaps. But yeah, it doesn't have that at this time. So feel free to. There's a GitHub. The GitHub repo for this. It's I can actually show you it right now. Let me just come
and there's actually a tool that I think might be able to do this. That was Didier, who has the Power BI side tools that can open up basically in folders in Visual Studio Code all of the metadata that's inside of a model And Visual Studio Code does have a find and replace across basically open items. So in theory, for the scenario that you're thinking about, I believe his side tools tool should do that, but obviously there's no extra validation or anything. It's just swapping, let's say sales amount with sales underscore amount. So a little riskier, but I think it would be possible in that other tool.
Exactly. So like here in Visual Studio in SSDT, this is the BIM file, right? This is the same. You can have the BIM file be a source or target of an ALM Toolkit comparison. And if you look in here, it's not formatted as with all of the color coding and everything, but this is just JSON, right? This is the same JSON that you see, when you're doing these comparisons, right? That you can edit in Visual Studio Code, but then this is just a safe way of doing it without, with guardrails of doing different modes. So ultimately, it's just JSON based. That's how we store the tablet object model metadata. And if you have any ideas like that, like as I say, this is the Managed Services Git repo. There's lots of other projects in here, some good stuff in here, including the metadata translator, which is another external tool, which I'll just quickly plug. This is built by Kai Uncroft, and this uses Azure Cognitive Services to default all of your translations as import and export from CSV, because a lot of translators are professional translators, but they have other translation tools as well. So then you can import and export the translations to the other tools. But this is a great tool as well. And so this normalizer is here. This is the repo that contains ALM Toolkit. And there's a bunch of other stuff here as well. But the reason I came in here is because you can raise issues in here, like let's see, I solved one just yesterday. Let me do it this way. So just a second. So I just did a release yesterday, and it was because someone asked for the ability to retain role members. Right. So then I got validation from a couple of other people that it would be a cool thing to do. So just yesterday, I pushed out a version that has this new option for you to be able to update, for example, the OLS rules and the RLS rules, but still retain the members in the roles. Right. So this is my kind of equivalent of ideas.powerbi.com.
And I think that with the GitHub, with any of these, it's the evolution that comes from them, both Power BI and for external tools, is really a lot of features that get added where it's like not something you ever might think about as, I wouldn't even think that this would be needed as like some kind of a business scenario, but the user feedback really helps change a lot of those. I've seen that with DAX Studio, Tabular Editor, and as you mentioned, people have commented on stuff that just, oh yeah, that's an idea that I never would have had, but I can certainly like integrate that with the tool now as a feature.
Exactly. And sometimes we have these kind of ideas, oh, maybe that'd be good, and then you forget about it, and then you have someone who actually asks for it and is like, yeah, okay, I've got validation from multiple people that this would be cool. So I said, fine, let's go ahead and do it. And it was fun. I did it.
Exactly. I think there's a couple of other questions that here we go. So I'm going to pop some of these up for you. James had another one. I just wanted to get him to clarify. So oh, never mind. So he was talking about for the side tools. So I'll actually side check that. Let's see. There was. Here we go. One from Matthias. He's been having some good questions today. Can you show a list of all the measures with that ALM tool and apply some changes to them in a quick way? So I guess have like a master list and be able to do like basically a multi-select and some type of a change across them. I'm trying to think of a scenario you would need to do that for, but I think that's what the question is alluding to.
So yeah, I mean, if you've got multiple measures, you can apply them all, changes all in one go, but there's no way of like selecting a bunch of measures and say, I want to apply a specific change, like, I don't know, a format string change. You probably use Tablet Editor for something like that, where you can multi-select and set the property in one go. And actually, Tablet Desktop does that now as well, right? You can be in here, this is one of the features of the new modeling tool, is that you can multi-select objects. And then now I can set things that are common across both of the tables, like the storage mode in one go. So yeah. Yeah,
the new modeling view had a lot of nice extra features that got added that There was a bit of back and
it's
forth with the MVPs on how
really
the relationship lines would look, but it eventually the paint finally dried on that.
yeah, yeah. And one quick point about this, much like the report view that is a TypeScript Chromium hosted, just like ALM Toolkit, this is as well, right? So I think we've already let the cat out of the bag that we're going to be doing web modeling. The reason we can do it is because this is all TypeScript as well. This can be hosted in the browser as well. Right?
Exactly.
The new one, not the old one, right? This is one of the strategic things about the new modeling.
All right. I think most of the questions that I had at the beginning were answered throughout the demo, but I'll just drop a quick note for anybody. If you have any remaining ones, go ahead and throw those in here now in case I missed a couple of them. But otherwise, like, yeah, I think there is so many use cases for this, well beyond that could ever even be demoed in like a couple of hours, just because it's designed for so many pro developer features. Let's see. Okay, so I did have one person pop out a question from the beginning. It's a technical question about actually using it, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, or it might go to that consultant answer. I just don't have enough information to be able to actually respond to it. But they were using the ALM toolkit to deploy changes to a dataset in premium capacity. Include cultures was enabled, but even though the deployment is successful, the linguistic schema was blank in the service.
Yes, so the linguistic schema is just being integrated. So the ALM toolkit is based purely on the tabular object model metadata, which is the same as what you see when you in the BIM file, which is this, and it's the same as what you see in SSMS when you script it out. And the linguistic schema, I believe, is in the process of being integrated into the TOM metadata. So I should. I will see whether that can be integrated or not. It's a prerequisite that it's integrated into the tabular object model metadata. But thanks for raising that, Gopa, and I will look into that to see whether it's feasible yet. Because as I say, it was traditionally stored separately in the Power BI desktop file, which makes it a little bit more of a challenge for this tool. But I do believe that they're in the process of integrating it, so I'll see what the status is on that.
Perfect. I have an interesting comment from Kirill. And actually, I just looked and I noticed that it's saying the same on mine, but apparently it must be like a hand part of the certification thing. I've had that a couple of times on my website. I forgot to renew something, so then for a while my Squarespace site said not secure, and then I had to go like fix some stuff back in the back end. So
yeah,
I'm assuming that's what it is.
So Kirill, it's just a question of timing. It's like, do I go and I'm not a web developer. Honestly. That website, which I can quickly bring up here, is the same. So if I do ALM search toolkit, and it says not secure, I assume that's what you're referring to there. And this is exactly the same website. If I do this,
It's the same
hoster. Code. This
was
written like donkeys years ago, right? I mean, I wrote this on a plane or something. Like this is based off one of the kind of sample websites that you get in Visual Studio that hasn't even been included in Visual Studio for like 5-10 years or something. This is like donkeys old. So yeah, it's just a question of prioritization. It's just like, do I go and do the retain role members or do I go and fix this? So it's just a question of prioritization. Yeah.
That's totally fair. But yeah, otherwise, I don't see any other questions popping up, so I think I was able to answer everything that people had. But this is a fantastic demo. I mean, I even learned stuff as well. I've used this certainly for a lot of change management, but it's always nice just to be able to come out of these even with a bit of extra knowledge on my end. And I'm sure everybody in the audience seems to have a lot of great questions, and quite a few people were very happy to just get a deep dive into the uses and also just some of the history of it. Like it's one of those things where I think a lot of people don't realize like how old analysis services is. It's not just a Power BI thing. It's been around for a very, very long time. Also with all this kind of management tools way back in the day. So it was interesting to watch it shift from highly customizable to very simplistic in Power BI, and then slowly back to enterprise and all those other features opening it up again. So it was an interesting kind of ebb and flow that happened with the evolution of it,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I totally get that. Cool. Well, thanks again, Reid. I really appreciate you setting this up. Thanks to everyone who attended. Hopefully, ALM Toolkit will help you in your daily lives, make your life a little bit easier. Feel free to play around with it, suggest new capabilities for it. I'd love to hear from you on ALM Toolkit. So thank you.
Absolutely, and have a great rest of your day. And everybody, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.
Great. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships as well. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on social media to help pass on this awesome content and to help the channel grow. So until next time.